Welcome to Wilder Wolves Hall of Fame Mode Fandom. My name is Wilder Adams, and with the season coming all the way back, we are returning an off-season series that will continue throughout the season, Wolves Fandom Friday. So everybody, every single Friday, we are going to have Timberwolves fans come on the show, and we'll just chop it up, talk about the biggest things going on throughout the season. And my first and very special guest of this year's season, Freddy Nivar, a Timberwolves and Celtics fan. The guy's he's got his own squad in the East and West, so he is covered from 6 p.m. to good midnight in the Boston area. Freddy, how are you doing?
How you doing? How you doing?
Doing great. Super happy to have you on, man. Give everybody an explanation. I think it's an interesting story because you were a Celtics fan for a long time, and you still consider yourself a Celtics fan, but you recently adopted the Timberwolves. I would love to hear that story.
Yeah, I still bleed green. It's still I'm a diehard Celtics fan. It's just once we got we had the KG influence from Minnesota, so we are huge. Just KG did a ton for us, and now like the Wolves finally in a window where that there's something to be excited about. Like they're building something legit. You look at that team and just the pieces they're built around with a piece like Ant-Man, and there is the Wolves Nation finally has something to look forward to. Finally has a squad and where you're no longer thinking about whether next year could be the year. Like now they finally in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've been able to watch that for a long time because we talked about it because you have a Dominican background, right? And Kat had a
Right.
Dominican background. So that also, on top of the KG connection, brought you to the team. So I thought that was really great. And it's funny because I think when you're a Celtics fan and you see what it looks like to win, I'm sure you've seen, the evolution of the Timberwolves organization, right? Because the team was a mess forever.
Right.
And you're so used to winning, so you know what it looks like. From a Celtics and now emerging Timberwolves fan, how have you seen like the evolution of the Timberwolves as an organization, in comparison to a team like the Celtics?
Like for a lot of my Celtics years, we were in a similar situation as Minnesota, where we had bad management. We would draft guys. We wouldn't give them a chance to grow. We missed on a lot of guys. So, we had Paul Pierce for a while, and Paul Pierce, we never really put anything around him until, he was already, getting up there past his prime. And, you see how, as a Celtics fan, you see the difference when you get at Danny Ainge, when you get, good front office piece that know what they're doing, and you see that with the Wolves. You go back, all the way to they have Roses and those other guys. Like those guys were already making, the way they were drafting was changing, the way that they were putting the pieces together. And then you hit on Ant-Man, and you see how they have structured the roster around them. Like like you see the difference in the growth from all the way from not just the roster construction, but all the way from management.
I love that you first started with the management because Minnesota, as you know, it's very rarely been a talent issue because they had KG and then they have all these high draft picks every year. Then they get like the Kevin Loves and the Ricky Rubios.
Right.
Ricky Rubio at one point was considered a potential like top 3 player in his draft class in
Right.
2009. And then like they didn't put that together. Then they get Cat, Wiggins, and Levine and all these talented guys. Aunt Jaden Nas, that isn't necessarily just a way more talented trio than those guys, but like you said, they had Gerson Rosas, who was the first guy who brought in those young players, and then Chris Finch and Tim Connolly. They really put that core in the oven, and
Right.
I would love to position that to this year now because we're now in year 6, and now they have Celtics like standards, right? Because they're expected to be back in the conversation. Ant's kind of the Tatum of the West in terms of every single year, despite his age, he's always expected to be in the conference finals now. So my question for you is, like, looking at this Timberwolves team this season, how do you feel about the current structure of the team this year, relative to like the last couple recent years?
Well, you gotta, for me is, is the depth of this team. Like when you look at this team up and down, you have a lot of young kids that can really, really come on and take a big leap. You have, and then you have even the young core is just coming into their prime. Like you got guys like McDaniels. Like, that kid is expected to take a leap this year. He was already one of the toughest defensive wings in the league. You saw him at times even carry the Wolves offensively. And it's just a different dynamic that the team has. I'm expecting Nas to have a stronger year than he did last year. For a lot of the year, he had a down year compared to the year he had the year before. And Randle be more comfortable there. I think Gobert will still be a beast. So and for me, it's just Ant-Man. Like, I just believe Ant-Man can he got another gear to go. And similar to Tatum, like, when you look at Ant-Man, like, it'll be tough for me to look at the end of the year and not see, like, if he's not in that top five. I will be surprised. I will be surprised if Ant-Man is not the guy. And a lot of people believe he's gonna be Luca, the guy that. But the thing is that Ant-Man had, with the shooting he added last year, you add more strength to his package. You add more athleticism because he's older now, going into his age 24 season. His IQ, his defense getting better. Like, what are the chances that he's not the best two-way player in the league this year?
That, I think, is absolutely the aspiration with how the media day's gone, because one of the biggest points of emphasis is, like, we need Ant to get back to being a high level defender. Like, Mike Conley talked about it. Like, they had a dinner and they were like, Ant, we need you to get back to being like a high level defender, and building off of that. Ant, we need not only that, but kind of go back to your roots as a high level young player. Get in transition more, get back to the hoop, do a lot of those things that made you Anthony Edwards, while still being one of the best shooters in the world and adding that mid-range package. I think it's definitely, doesn't it feel like that year, kind of like when, Tatum kind of made his finals run, where it's like, can we finally see it come all together into one? Like, you see parts of their game mold from year to year, but those new parts get overemphasized in different years, and then they're getting better, but they still could bring back what initially got them there. I think Ant and Tatum have similar parallels there. Do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're gonna see, like, we are gonna start going from, oh my God, like, he's so good because he's so young, and getting these passes similar to Tatum. Like, people, like, the expectations are gonna change. Like, the Wolves are expected to be a championship squad, and now people are not just gonna feel good if you get so farther than the previous guys. Now they seen which was happening to Tatum. Tatum's been winning since he got to Boston, and the expectations every year just get crazier and crazier. Where he's like, but that's what comes with once you enter that tier where you're in the top five. And now, if you have an even decent team, you're expected to bring it home. Where now he'll be scrutinized differently. Where greatness is expected out of him.
It's such a double-edged sword too, because you have some players, even like Shea when he was young. Like, people talk about Shea like he's 3 years younger than Luka Doncic, or like 3 years younger than Tatum, because he just kind of spawned out of nowhere in the playoffs. Even though
Right.
it's been 5 years we never saw him. you see Ant every year, you see Tatum every year, you see Luka every year. So those guys, they kind of lose their spark, their magic, their appreciation because they should get there. That's the expectation.
Right.
And they get into conversations with people who are like 5 years older than them, rather than like for Ant, like the Cade Cunninghams, who's literally Ant's age, but nobody
Right.
talks about them like they're the same age group. I think it's definitely a double-edged sword because it feels like those Ant won't get the same grace this year, which isn't a bad thing either, because he does have the capabilities to take that next step like Tatum did as an NBA champion.
Right. And you also saw management span in a year where everybody was looking to save money. The Wolves went all in on their guys. They pay Randle, they pay Gobert, they paid McDaniels, they pay Nasri. Like, a lot of people thought that, not all those guys will be able to be brought back to the roster. But it goes to show, like, the ownership and management, sees that, this team, has what it takes, and they're committed to spending on the core to make sure that they stay competing for championships. So, like, this is why, the fans should have higher expectations, because this is the core, right? They locked in this core, and this looks like the core that they have prepared for Ant's prime. How they tweak around it, we will see, but everything is already there with the young kids that they have brought in, like Conley getting older, and Rob being brought in as a high pick. Like, there'll be big expectations from the young kids if you're winning. You know what I mean? If you're winning and you're expected to win, you're not gonna have the luxury of waiting, because you're expected to be good right now.
And I love that you mentioned the contracts as well, because not only are they spending, but they're also very, like you articulated, super strategic with how they spent, right? Because a couple years ago, they were as all in. They paid Cat a crap load, the max,
Right.
Rudy Gobert, the max, Ant, the max. They were able to pay everybody in the modern CBA landscape where they're not over the second apron anymore, because they were able to, instead of have 3 supermax contracts, turn it into like 4 like lesser contracts of
Right.
similar players. Like, instead of paying Cat 60, you're paying Randle 33. You're paying Rudy 36 now. You're paying Nas and Jaden 25 to 27. And then you're also getting deeper because they use those picks on a Beringer. You get Dante in there. You get Rob in there. I think it's just been, honestly, incredible management with where they were a couple years ago, because with the wrong management, you could have leaned into those 3, which would have won you basketball games. But the initial questions of the Rudy trade, how do you build a young core around Ant? That becomes a massive question. So they're spending and they're highly strategic, which a team like the Celtics, that's what they've historically done.
Right. And in this new double cap era that we are entering, like, you have to be. There is, like, you see how teams are maneuvering. You see the Celtics, like, we potentially blew up a championship window, because we can't you can't afford to compete in this era, and already go in it over the cap, and still compete. And you see the Wolves don't care. Like, this is an ownership, and they believe that this team is legit. And right, like, why wouldn't you believe if you clearly have OKC as, they're all kids, so you're expecting them, projecting them to get better based off what they brought to the table last year. We'll see how, we know it's very hard to win back to back, especially for the youngest team to ever do it. And you obviously have the Rockets loaded up. They have a young backcourt with Fred out for, now, but there's a ton of upside, and they're a very deep team. The Nuggets got deeper, and a lot of people believe the Lakers are legit this year. Like, even though, like, I don't see the Lakers, beating a healthy Wolves team, in a playoff matchup. Like, OKC is a team the Wolves, because of they could match them defensively, they could match them offensively, they could match them even with their star power. Like similar to the Rockets. Like the Wolves have that. They have all the ingredients in the roster with the high end pieces and the depth where you can go deep enough and be able to compete with a team like OKC.
I absolutely. And I think you mentioned it, like how Minnesota has an edge in certain ways against every team. And I think a lot of those specific edges, right? Like OKC, like you said, incredibly young. Asking that team to go on a back to back when a lot of them are 22-year-old men with a lot of money in the offseason, already NBA champions, can kind of do whatever they want. And
Right.
we'll see how they start the year. Or
And they
a
all
team
got
like
paid. All those children got paid too. So it's like there's a lot. There's a lot to be expected, and you're gonna be, for a while. OKC, nobody, even last year, people still thought OKC was, people were overlooking OKC, even as dominant as they looked. This year, you'll be hunted all year. So it'll be a different year for OKC, and we'll see how this affects that young team, which like gives a team like Minnesota, a legitimate chance to come in, because you're firing on all cylinders because of how well balanced you are, and you could really give it to anybody that they put in front of you.
And teams like Houston and Denver, even the Lakers, you can go top to bottom. There's just a decent amount of change to a lot of these rosters. And Minnesota, they don't really have a lot of change. Literally, the only change is like implementing Shannon and Rob for Nikhil's minutes and things like that. So I want to use this to transition to the preseason conversation because Minnesota, their expectation is and should be to start fast. Just get as many wins in November, December, January to get a cushion for when things inevitably go up and down during the middle of the year and other teams get better. So my first question for you is, what should Minnesota look for in the preseason as like positive indicators for the start of the year? What would be successful things to happen this preseason for the team?
I mean, for me, it will be, seeing just the growth of the children. Like how comfortable is McDaniels getting to his spots. How loose is Rob playing out there. How explosive is Shannon looking. Like, I'm looking to see how, because that Mike Conley is, if you're counting on Mike Conley to be your main guy for next to Ant-Man, it's a lot to ask for him. You want him more in the Al Hartford, like mental role where he's still a high-end veteran, but you're not counting on him to be your main guy. So, especially Rob, like, like for me, like he is the one for me, man, where like, he is just a ceiling breaker, because if he's a guy that gets an opportunity, or he takes a leap that's big enough for him to even get like legit minutes, up the off the bench, where he is put in a position where he is asked to go out there and just get you buckets. Like, what are the chances that that he doesn't look like, how we had pressure last year, where these guys giving you efficient numbers from threes, efficient numbers off the bounce, efficient numbers at the hoop, efficient. So like, if that's what Minnesota has their own version of Darius Garland in that kid, and his development is huge for the future of this team.
I love that you started with Rob because I think that's what everybody's looking for. And people are wondering, what does the point guard position look like for Minnesota to start the year? And like Finch has talked about it in preseason, that they're starting with Mike and they're leading with that trust and that expectation that coming into this year healthier and with a more defined role, he'll play better. And like Rob, the role isn't against him, but Rob's going to have to take it over Mike.
Right.
So, right, like you mentioned, the year two Darius Garland leap, it would be great if there's a world where Rob Dillingham makes it undeniable and you have to start him. And preseason is a great start just to see how comfortable does he look. It doesn't really matter to me whether he shoots 75% from the field or 40% necessarily. How comfortable does he look? How in pace does he have to look? Because Finch has also talked about when Rob becomes like a starter in the future, it's going to be because he uses his speed, get to the heart of the defense, and utilize that playmaking as much as his scoring and his floor spacing ability. So I do fully agree that Rob's important, especially with the team's goals to push the pace, play faster. They're talking about Mike like, yeah, we want Mike to have the ball and like push the ball, which is ideal for him when he's playing. But there's no doubt, like if you're going to play fast, hopefully Rob can do it and do it efficiently, because in that world he does it better than Mike, who's 37. So yeah, I fully agree with that. And what do you think of like when you look at the rookies, right? Like Beringer, Zikarsky, how are you looking at those players?
Yeah, I'm excited about Beringer, and like I just like you talk about a kid with no ceiling. Had he been drafted by by another team, another front office, I could have been scared about that pick, but since it was the front office that took him, and they believe in his upside. He is really just a empty glass. That kid, they scouts rave about his footwork, which is huge, especially for a big man. And, especially one that started playing basketball not too long ago. You look to see how does he look out athletically. He's still a child. He'll need some time to develop, but you want to see, how he impacts the game defensively, how active he is, and just what he could potentially do offensively as a lob threat, as a rim running big, and and just to see what else he could do, because he's an unknown kid, but people don't realize like this kid has as much upside as a lot of these kids in the draft.
I love that take with Beringer because, like you said, if he ends up on a team, I'm going to take shots at teams because it's a fan podcast.
I didn't want to mention anybody.
Not to mention anybody, but if he ended up on the Charlotte Hornets or the Chicago Bulls,
Right? Who be scared?
I would have been petrified, right? But like you said, I mean, he's on a team where they're not going to rush his development. When he can play, he probably will. And he's learning behind Rudy Gobert, like the perfect player for his archetype,
Perfect mentor.
but nationality too. And then like the coaches who have the development history, all of that, like I think it's exciting because the kid, one thing I learned about him this summer is kid's intense. He's
Wow.
very intense. Like watching him in Vegas this summer when I was covering the Wolves a little bit, he's very much a I go to work, I go to bed personality.
Wow.
And that's all he does. And one of my friends, Andrew Dukowitz, who was just on the show, he talked about him and he was like, yeah, like very nice kid, very focused, can't get a lot out of him. He just wants to go to play basketball, go to bed. And I thought that was perfect.
Wow.
So he has the mental, and he talked about it in media day. And he said, my goal is to be one of the very best players in the world. That's what I live for.
Wow.
So I think if you're a Beringer fan, you hear those quotes and you eat them up.
Right. You want to see something. You want to see something in preseason, especially you got veteran bigs, so you don't necessarily have to establish your bigs, and like you're saying, they've been on the roster, so they know their roles. They'll be trying some different things, but you really want to see like what these children can do, and Beringer is a guy that like if you're a Wolves fan, you want to watch this kid closely because like he's a potential, who knows, like he could be a higher end version of Serge Ibaka. Like it's just some guy that comes out of it seems nowhere, and then he develops this game that you didn't know he could develop, because when he came in he was so raw.
Totally. In this preseason, like we're not asking him to fully expand his game, right? But let's see the athleticism, let's see the motor. Can he play in
Right.
transition with Rob? And can he also do it while showing the defensive patience he showed in Summer League? Because that's what stood out to me, how ready he looked defensively in Summer League. Of course, Big's foul in Summer League, and they're going to call everything because it's ref training as much as player training. But he did show all of the instincts are there in him, which might separate him from a Jackson Hayes to a Tyson Chandler eventually
Right.
put together.
There's a big difference. There's a big difference between the two prospects. But they'll see look lost out there. Those are things you're looking at. They'll see look, you see missing on his assignment. Like you're expecting that from a kid, right? But how he recoups, how he, his instincts, his natural instincts that, and do we see it? Do we see potential of the player that he could be once he grows into his man body, once he has some years under his belt, and he has enough game in him to know who he is as a player.
Absolutely. And I think preseason will be a big start to that. And transitioning to some of the veterans on the team, let's start with Anthony Edwards because all of us like talking about Ant, right? But what are you looking for Ant in this preseason?
You wanna, I wanna see Ant. I wanna see him in that playmaking role. I wanna see what it looks like with him, in the D Wade spot where you're a shooting guard, but everything is running through you, and you're affecting the game without you necessarily scoring. Because we know he could shoot it. We know he could get his. You want to see him, be more aggressive towards the hoop. You also want to see, maybe some of the things that that MJ that was trying to teach him. What has he added to his bag? Like what in his approach. You just want to know, like, what is it? What is going to be his mentality, his approach this year? Is he, he's going to be looking to establish himself as a top player. You want to see that extra gear. You want to see, it's like, man, like, he looks different. Like that's what you want to see from a player like Ant, coming into the preseason.
Absolutely. And what we've seen from Ant in the past in the preseason, like notably last year, he loves to show off what he's done in the offseason. And I remember during preseason, and he's just like jacking threes, like just throwing like 10 a game. And like he had
Mm.
8 threes in the preseason against the Knicks last year, and you see signs of that. Or like the year before when he's like trying to show, like, I got the bank shot now. Like every preseason, he's like really trying to show what he's added. So if that continues, what did he add this year? Like you said, yeah, like in the past, we've seen Ant talk about like in media days that he really wants to just work on not always needing the ball in transition because it's so instinctual for him to just like want to get the rock and like push it. But with what he brings to the team as like a shooter and just as an overall dynamic player, he doesn't always need the ball. Sometimes with a player like Mike, when he's in transition, it's better with Mike having the ball. So Ant can use that, just run up the floor, let the athleticism take over, let the floor spacing take over. So he's not like one dimensional to the extent where the game is slowing down. Because the Timberwolves, they need to play faster. They need to play much faster. So if they have Ant in that situation where it's like, look, when in doubt, push it, whether it's with the ball or if you don't have the ball, don't run to the ball and slow the offense down by running to the ball in transition. Just get the heck out and space the floor or go for a slam. Like that's going to be really interesting if Ant, really, says or does exactly what he says he wants to work on this offseason, which would be like being out in transition more, maybe not spamming one thing, but showing like, because he studied all this tape this summer, the game is slowing down. Now I know what the team needs, and I don't need to show that I can just hit these glass shots or 3-point shots, which were great things in the past, but we're kind of getting to that stage. It's not about how skilled you are, it's about what you do with your skill. And I think Ant's at that point of his career where it's not about the skill now, it's just knowing where to pick his spots.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we know he can put up numbers, right? We know that he's gonna get his. Now we're looking at impact. How are you impacting the game, at all levels? When, if you, like you're saying, if you're off the ball and you are, you're cutting to the rim, you are doing different things that are causing the defense to react, and he's gonna set and open things up for everybody else around you. He's gonna open things up for you to take easier shots. And we already know, he's a good shooter. So if he's getting easier shots, he's putting up more efficient numbers, which is going to impact winning more. So all these things, and you have guys like Randle that, like when Minnesota was playing him in like that Sabonis role, where Randle was giving you 7, 8 assists, like that team was, they were flying everywhere. Like, it's tough to guard a team, that has bigs and guys that are that skilled at finding their open teammates. So it's like, if you have Conley playmaking, you have Randall playmaking, that opens up things for Ann, to do more things off the ball and impact and affect the game in way more ways than only when he has the ball in his hands.
Yeah, totally. And hopefully this preseason, we're seeing them try to get him in those spots where he is making decisions with the ball. And when he isn't with the ball, he's decisive about it. I think that's the right balance that you're articulating. And like now let's like transition to some of the other veterans beyond the young players, the point guards. What are you looking for? Because you just mentioned Randall. What are you looking for from some of the other veterans like the Rudy Goberts, Julius Randles, Dante DiVincenzo's?
Yeah, Rudy Gobert, like, you're just hoping that he doesn't take a step back. Like for me, with him, like, injuries could be a thing for Gobert, as he gets older, but, like a lot of those defensive bigs, like if they stick to their roles, I'm expecting him to have a similar year. And, we know how he impacts the defensive end of the floor. So from Gobert, Minnesota just needs him to stay Gobert, and, but some of the other guys like Nas Reed, like Nas Reed is still a guy that's growing. Like to me, that's why, like, there were teams like Detroit, there were other teams that, Nas Reed would have been a high MPs on any other team. And he chose to stay here, to play a role either off the bench or as a starter. That's a guy that, was literally, one of the best, 3-point shooting bigs, and one of the best handles in the game. So, if this guy is coming off the bench, like that should be again, another piece that should be the sixth man of the year, and should finish, in the top two, top three of best, most impact bigs, especially with his ability to spread the floor. And even McDaniels is still young, but at this point, he's starting to fall in that veteran category. Where, like, you're no longer, expected the children mistakes. You'll be asked to be a more of a leader defensively too, especially if you're the main wing defender, taking the toughest assignments. Like, you respect him, like, ideally, guys like Shannon, to take those type of guys under his wing, so that they can, also grow, because Minnesota's upside defensively, like, Dante can do everything. You know what I mean? Like, that's another guy that, he can start. This he can come off the bench. Like, that's a high end piece of the bench. When you compare him to some of the other pieces, like, and he was, he had a time where it took him a while to get used to his role, but once he got comfortable, like, that's another high end piece that the Wolves have in their hands at their disposal.
You mentioned the defensive element, right? How critical it is that this team plays that elite level defense. And they've talked about trying to be a number one defense again this year. That's their goal. They want their attention to detail. Now they're familiar with each other to take that next step. And we saw that with the first like Cat Rudy iteration where the first year it's like up and down and they're like the 10th ranked defense. The second year, the chemistry really came together and they were the number one defense. And we saw those signs in the preseason that year when the normal rotation was playing in the first half, them just dominating people. What do you think about the importance of this team when they have their main rotation guys in the first half of these preseason games? How important is it for them that they showcase that they're just more synergized than these other teams are playing early on?
Yeah, I think that's gonna be a factor in, especially like you're saying, those earlier games that can allow Minnesota to really get off the gate hot, because of the synergy that they should already have on display. Like you're saying, especially defensively, there's a very well balanced defensive team. Like you got good defense at the guard spot, good defense at the wing spot, good defense at the big man spot. So and especially if you're a team that already knows each other, right? If your defense is in the top 10, like, then there's no reason why offensively you shouldn't be that, especially with the pieces you have in place. You guys got have guys that can, that can kill you inside. There's a lot of guys that could spread the floor, and then you guys have the high end pieces in guys like Ant-Man that can match anybody's number one. So, like offensively, the Wolves can be as good as anybody, and defensively, they should be one of the biggest bully ball teams in the league.
And that's something that, going back to the preseason, that should, in my opinion, happen quick, right? Because preseason's all about getting to know each other. So if you know each other, then a lot of these things should come together if you're winning in the past. Now transitioning to the end of the show, what do you think should be Minnesota's like general expectation in preseason? Do you expect them to dominate? Do you expect them to just kind of ease their way in and figure things out? What do you think the team should expect to do in terms of performance early on?
Yeah, I think it depends on what they focus on in the preseason. If they focus on seeing what the children can do, then you're not gonna see a lot of the veteran play. But if you are seeing how does the core perform as a unit, then you should be seeing some potential dominant stretches throughout the preseason that can show what they will be during the year, especially with their offense flowing ideally, and the defensive effort being there from day one. They should be coming into the year looking to establish an identity as being a team that should be at the top and taken serious right from the get. And I that's the expectations that they should set and set the tone right from preseason.
That's great. I love how you framed it rather than being like it's about wins and losses on the raw surface. It's more about when the veterans play, what does the intentionality look like? Are they intentional defensively? Are they intentional working on those little things to take the next step? Do they look synergized as a veteran group? And then if you're just focused on the young players, like you said, like they can lose when they play. Hopefully not. Hopefully they look really good, but it depends on the priority this preseason. And I think we'll start seeing Saturday what it looks like. I think we all expect, of course, you're not going to play the starters 38 minutes at this time of the year.
Right.
So let's hope the 18 minutes they get are fantastic. So, Freddie, thank you so much for being on the show. This was incredible. Any last thoughts before we close it out?
Absolutely, my brother. Just another, like if you're Wolves Nation, like for me, like you gotta go back all the way to the year where Spreewell was there. Man, Spreewell was already at the tail end of his prime. Like he had clearly 2 years left, and then Sam Cassell was already, but that was all KG needed. And that was a very exciting year. That's the only year that you can look back at And, you know, you guys haven't had anything like that since. And this is a year where you're looking at this Wolves team. You know, if you're Wolves Nation and this team didn't get far this year and they were healthy, you know, it will be a very disappointing year. Like the expectations should be high, and understandably so, because this is about the best team that I believe the Wolves have put together in this, in at least in this generation, for sure.
And that's incredible to say. Obviously, the standards aren't that high relative to other teams in the past. So at least we do have a team to be excited about. And this team continuity has been a theme at training camp. And I think they are hoping to make that an advantage, which hopefully that continuity showcases in the preseason. And Freddie, thank you so much for being on today's show. And everybody, Freddie's an example. You can follow the Timberwolves all over the country. He lives in Massachusetts. He
Right.
loves the Celtics, and he's becoming a growing Timberwolves fan. And we've talked about that quite a bit. And you can listen to the Wolves in any part of the country. And this community, we're going to be more than glad to have you. If you want to be on a Wolves Fandom Friday episode, anybody can come on the show. All you have to do is give me a DM on What's on Tap NBA on X or Instagram, or you can email me at wilder@wilderadams.com. Yes, there's a lot of Wilders in my domain, but you could just leave me an email there. You can give me a DM and we can get something scheduled, because this is something that's going to happen every Friday throughout the regular season. And it's just a way I want this fan base to have a place where they can talk basketball on a platform. So I'm hoping that is going to be that for you. And Freddie is another example of a fantastic fan who knows his stuff, and he can follow the Timberwolves all over the country. And we saw he knows a ton about the Timberwolves. Thank you all so much
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, Freddie. It's a pleasure having you on. Thank you all so much for listening. Subscribe if you haven't already. Would sincerely appreciate it. We're getting things started for the 25-26 season, so let's get it rolling. This is Wilder Wolves Hall of Fame Mode Fandom.